She's gone to Tennessee.
Well, she's got another week.
Hey, Ann.
Traffic was super fun today.
See, that's what I'm
Always.
saying. But it was great when you got to Raleigh.
Oh, it was bad coming from,
Oh my God.
side were you coming
From Fuquay.
Okay.
And it was packed. Got to Garner. I got to about, I don't know, where the Wilmington Street split. It was wide open then. I guess I was on the back end of rush hour.
Okay, we're live.
You need to call roll and we good.
We're good.
I'm just gonna go ahead and start.
All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the December 12th, 2019 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. This Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs and licensure. My name is Patrick Miller, and I'm chairman of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I will now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Commission members, you have had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the December 12th, 2019 meeting?
So move.
Have a motion and a second. That was Connie. Was that Connie? Yes. Thank you, Connie. Have a motion and a second to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The agenda has been approved. Thank you. The minutes from our previous commission meetings on November 14th, 2019 and December 2nd, 2019 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
So moved.
Have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to approve the minutes from November 14th and December 2nd meetings. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes have been approved. Thank you. I now call on Drs. Kim Evans and Tom Tomberlin to provide the State Board of Education and NCDPI updates.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
There were 3 items that went for approval this month at the State Board for the month of December, and the first one is the RTI EPP to be an approved initially authorized EPP, and they agreed to change their name because it is so close to Pathways to Practice, and so they agreed to that through a letter. They have not decided on a name yet, but they are approved as an initially authorized EPP for the state. The second item, which went for action as well, were changes to LICN 001 and LICN 005, which we approved previously. They were unanimously approved. And then lastly, the adoption of permanent rules, which we had already looked at for TCED and LICN policies. They were approved to be permanent rules and move forward to OAH. Now Dr. Tomberlin will provide the last update.
Good morning. Do we have the next slides? Okay. So this past month at the State Board of Education meeting, I presented an update on EPPs to the board. This was a very short presentation, largely in response to a September presentation that the board received from the NCTQ, the National Council of Teacher Quality, in which some statements were made about how EPPs in the state of North Carolina conduct business, basically. And so we wanted to make sure that the board had an accurate view of how EPPs measure teacher pass rates in the state, as well as some other things about the productivity of our EPPs across the state of North Carolina. So the first slide that I presented to the board was to show the pathways for North Carolina. And here you can see from 2014 to 2018, the output of teachers that our North Carolina EPPs have prepared. There is some decline from 2014 to 2018, but as you can see, there's peaks and valleys within that movement from 2014 to 2018. Overall, from 2014, we've experienced about a 11% decline in the number of teachers that are completing our programs through our North Carolina EPPs. You can also look at alternative. So anybody going through a lateral entry that's affiliated with one of our North Carolina EPPs is included in this, and that has seen, we can see in 2017 a very large increase, but then in 2018 an ultimate decline from the 2014 numbers. It's not clear to me whether that means we know that these are relatively small numbers compared to the number of teachers that are going through a lateral entry the number of lateral entry teachers we output every year. Is the only thing I can infer from this is more teachers were availing themselves of the RAUC process or other non-EPP alternative programs. With residency coming online this year, we should see a really large increase in this number from the 2018 to the 2019 school year, given that now residencies have to align or affiliate with an EPP. So the next issue that was raised with the state board was the statement that was made from NCTQ was that in North Carolina, as in many other states across the country, a student is only considered a completer of an EPP if he or she passes the licensure exam associated with that program. And therefore, we only count those people who pass the test as in North Carolina, and that artificially inflates our pass rates in North Carolina because we're not counting those people who don't pass the test because we don't consider them completers. So this caused a lot of concern by board members, and I was able to illustrate to them that that is not, in fact, how we calculate pass rates in the state of North Carolina, that folks who complete a program, who graduate and seek employment in North Carolina, are licensed in North Carolina, that's how we calculate pass rates. And then we look at whether they passed the test in the first year that they completed their program. And you can see here those annual pass rates are listed, and there is a steady declination of the pass rates from 2014 to 2018, about a 16 percentage point decrease overall. Now, this has largely been attributed to the test is harder than it was in the past, or one possible theory that has been floated out there is that our EPPs are not doing as well as they were before in preparing our teachers for these tests. I personally do not think that either one of those things are at play here. What I see is the implementation of the policy that you can be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years without having passed that the test, and that some of our teachers will take as much time as they have in order to pass the test, and others will get the job done up front. I do have to say that a couple months prior to that, we presented to the board kind of the true pass rates. So we presented a cohort pass rate to the board where we looked at, I think it was 16, 17, and 18. So that cohort that came out of EPPs in 16, they had about I think it was an 80-some% pass. Well, it looks like an 88% pass rate. And but if you looked at those students that came out over the next 2 years and tracked them about when they passed the test, then the cumulative pass rate was back up in the high 90s. So there was evidence that students are just, or teachers coming out are not taking the test multiple times in 1 year in order to pass it, but they're taking the test multiple times over successive years in order to eventually pass it. So that was an important thing to put before the board. I have to report to Pepsi that there was concern by board members that we are allowing teachers to go into the classroom without having passed the test.
Good.
And there was some discussion about that, and then there was in the issue that what we've found, given this policy shift, with teachers going into the classroom for multiple years without having passed the test, that when we look at those teachers compared to initial passers, we don't see any difference in their effectiveness of those teachers. So while it is true that the licensure exam is not predictive of future effectiveness, some of the board members did feel like it did offer you a baseline understanding of competency of the content that they felt was important, regardless of whether it was predictive of effectiveness.
Are these EPP pass rates only, or is it all individuals?
This
Like
is for our EPPs.
Only EPPs?
I missed the question.
Is this for
is
EPPs?
This only North Carolina EPPs, or does it include anyone who would have come in from a route outside of North Carolina? Or inside, right? Like, so if I
No.
went through Western Governors, or if I went through Now This Teach Tomorrow, or any of these other groups. So is this the cumulative number of all individuals, or just North Carolina EPPs?
I would even narrow it further to this is EPPs housed within IHEs, because we used institution codes to gather these.
Okay.
So this is you had to be affiliated
So
with
this is
App
our-
State. This is
our data.
independent colleges, university, and university system
Okay.
IHE EPPs.
And Western Governors, they're an EPP.
I'd
wouldn't
have
have
to
been
go back and look and see if Western Governor's appearing anywhere in there, it could only be 17 or 18.
They just came online, so.
But it
Yeah,
could
they're-
also include route folks?
So it does not include route
Does
folks.
not
That I
include-
can tell you.
okay.
Yes, this is only looking at people who had an affiliation with an EPP housed in an IHE. And I'm sorry for all the acronyms. EPP is Educator Prep Program, housed within an Institute of Higher Education. That is a university, a UNC system school, or one of a North Carolina schools, independent colleges or universities in North Carolina.
And Tom, just for making sure I'm clear, did you say earlier whether or not a candidate passed the exam is not indicative, is not predictive of their impact on students?
That is correct. So that has been, we've done research on that, as well as EPIC at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. EPIC has found that there is some statistically significant but moderate correlations between advanced math and science in the test, and some correlation with the reading
Foundations
of reading. But other than that, no, there's no difference.
And from the board meeting, is it correct that we do have data in the state that if a candidate completes the university-based educator preparation program, they do have a greater likelihood of positively impacting student achievement. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, if you'd go to the next slide, that is one of the things we presented to the board. So I apologize for the backgrounds, the colors didn't come out great, but here you can see, oh, I'm sorry, that's not the slide I wanted. That's a diversity slide. I have presented evidence on this before to the board that on average, our most effective route is a traditional educator prep program. And as well as being the most effective, it is the pathway which produces the most persistent teachers in our state. So after 5 years, about 71% of our teachers our traditionally prepared teachers are still in the classroom, as compared with lateral entry, about 48% of those are still in the classroom. So more than half have left by the end of 5 years, and out-of-state teachers, more than half of those have left after 5 years.
If I can ask one more question, have we disaggregated the tests so we can look at individual exams or performance? Like EdTPA, for example, do we have enough EdTPA data to know whether EdTPA?
No, not at this point.
uh,
There's no,
It's year 3, right?
yeah, we have no confidence that there was randomization of the 30% who took it with these schools. So I don't think we can really look into this until we have a full complement of test takers. The other thing that was presented here is some questions came up that were presented to the board around the disaggregation of pass rates for different demographic groups in our state. And here I'm forced to agree with NCTQ that there are disparities between pass rates on the licensure exam between our majority students and our minority students, particularly African American students, disproportionately fail our licensure exams at higher rates than their counterparts, and you can see that. So in this chart, African American is the orange bar, Latinx is white, and Asian is the yellow, and then you have all others, which would be mixed races and other Pacific Islander and Native American. So there is disproportionality there. You can see that it seems to be getting worse from what we saw in 2014. And again, this may be a function of the wait until 3 years to pass the test. It's really hard to tell from the data, but it's certainly something to be concerned about and to be considered.
Is there a weighting problem here, right, where because our students are overwhelmingly white, it's a really large sample, and we're comparing a really large sample of white students to non-white students?
So these are percentages, so you would hope that the percentages would be consistent regardless of the size of the group, but
It also appears, I mean, there's some clustering for non-whites, right, where they seem to be, even though everyone has dropped, you see what I'm saying, right? African American students seem to have done better in 18, 17. Am I reading that right?
Right. Well, so there's the initial kind of downward slope to 17, and then in 18 we see a rise there from 17 to 18.
I mean, I'm just curious what's going to happen in 19, 20, right? As students as EPPs become more familiar with the new exams that we put in place last year. Particularly elementary mathematics.
The other thing that's interesting in this is that we've looked at we looked at pathways in race, and 60% of our African American teachers are coming through the lateral entry process, and we've already shown earlier that the vast majority of those don't go through EPPs for a lateral entry process. So it could be we have very small numbers here, and that something different may or may not be going on with that, with the majority of our African American teaching candidates that would not be included in this. But this is restricted to those folks who are going through an EPP process.
Do you have this, Tom, is this broken down by major or anything?
No, not at this point. But that is one thing that we are that we're happy to talk about is the educator preparation dashboard that's being created. As you know, we've brought the Ed Quality dashboard over from the UNC system and housed it here at DPI so that we can include both UNC system EPPs and our EPPs from independent colleges and universities. And so here is a list of the measures that will be included on that EdPrep dashboard, as well as the method of disaggregation. So our hope is that we'll be able to see publicly and within institutions that you'll be able to see these metrics and how they're and how our different race and ethnicities are performing on those metrics, as well as sex. But you raised an important point. Could these be further disaggregated by program? And in some cases, I would say the answer would be yes. But in many cases, the sample size is going to be too small for us to report because we can't run the risk of identifying an individual. So we'd have to have a group of 10 or more. So some of your more your less popular programs, if we reported on them, we'd be reporting on an individual.
Did you want to say more about that slide? I sort of want to pull the previous conversation into this one.
Okay.
And from a, excuse me, a policy perspective, if the data we have as a state, excluding yet TPA, because we don't know yet, if the data on the test tells us, does not tell us anything that is important to know relative to student achievement, that passing or not is not indicative or predictive of impact on student achievement. We are in essence requiring students to do something that is not of benefit in a policy perspective, that adds additional cost to becoming a teacher, and it's discriminatory elimination. So they're taking the test is eliminating people being removed from the pipeline because they can't pass a test that is not predictive of student achievement. It suggests to me we should strongly consider the value of the test.
I think that is an appropriate consideration. However,
this is Glenda, could you restate that? Because I think I agree with him 100%.
well, let's certainly get that on the record.
Write that down.
Dr. Dempsey, would you like to repeat that statement?
Yes, thank you. Was that Glenda?
Yes.
Thank you. That if from a policy point of view and us making recommendations about future action, we are requiring students to take a series of tests that do not have predictive value relative to their impact on student achievement. And there are two additional negative consequences. One is the cost to the candidates of having to take tests that do not serve a policy or professional standard purpose. One is the cost. Two, it is discriminately restricting the pipeline for potential teachers of color because they are not passing a test that does not tell us anything about their capacity to impact student achievement in the first place. It suggests to me that's a significant policy consideration based on the limited discussion today. We should consider the role and potential elimination of the tests themselves, or at least identify a purpose for them.
So,
Well, I would actually make a motion to support that, Dr. Dempsey.
So what this discussion is being had in several venues, and my personal perspective on this is that it's insufficient to say this is not working, let's get rid of it. What has to happen is this is not working, here's what we should do instead. and developing a process for ensuring that any kind of barrier to or performance task set before a prospective teacher is linked with better student outcomes. And of course, that's what everybody would want, and that's kind of the holy grail of your licensing requirements. I will defer to Dr. Miller as to whether he would like to speak to any process that is ongoing in that regard.
I think we saw with, was it Senate Bill 219 that we worked with this past legislative session, that the language requiring testing for licensure is in statute. And I'm looking at Eric Snyder, and he's nodding. And we, as a body, do not have the authority to override statutes. So we would, if we want to address what Dr. Dempsey talked about, and I would certainly be in favor of going down that road, then that is an ask of the General Assembly.
Can I make a comment on that
Yes.
as well? So I think, so these are licensing exams at the back end of the program. And so it's also possible that we don't know if they actually have an impact on student achievement, because all we're talking about is student achievement as a score on a standardized test, right? And so we've kind of artificially funneled down this, right, idea that teacher performance or teacher effectiveness is all about a test score. And so we might be making a decision on something that we don't really know, I think. But I think one of the things we ought to address, but I am in favor of what's been said, right? However, I think we also need to have this conversation about the Praxis core,
Yes.
which does the exact same thing. It disproportionately impacts candidates. It narrows the pipeline across the state, and it does not have any predictive validity for teacher effectiveness either. And so if we're going to evaluate and hold programs accountable on the back end through the dashboard, then we ought to allow programs to make the decision as to whether or not students are admitted, not the entrance exam. So that I know is also in statute based on having an entrance exam.
So I would.
This is Sam Houston.
Let him speak up.
It's very difficult to participate in a meeting like this on the telephone, to tell you the truth, because I can't see the whites of your eyes. But I think we have to be very careful. We even talk about removing an expectation, whatever it may be, whether they're valid or not. Don't get me wrong on that. Whether they have the extreme validity that we're looking for or not, without having a better plan, it'll be criticized as lowering standards or removing appropriate processes to ensure quality. Again, whether or not that's true based on factual information is a different issue. I just think we have to be smart. We have to be smart about our language, and we need to have a better plan if we're going to change a plan.
I just want to be clear about my comment. I'm not proposing that we entertain a motion today to eliminate. I understand the chairman's point that this is an issue for the General Assembly. What I am saying is if information that at least as of this meeting has this level of clarity has been put before us, it is raising a question about two dynamics that we know restrict the pipeline: the cost of the exams and the ability to pass the exams, and they, in a way that clearly discriminates based on the data we've seen today, the number of students of color who ultimately will become teachers, and that is a critical issue in North Carolina. What I'm suggesting is the commission should seriously consider ways to look at that data and look at those policy decisions that follow legislative decisions. And I would suggest strongly that if our recommendation needs to be based on that analysis, needs to be made to the General Assembly, we should do so. But we should not have any barriers that exist in eliminating people who want to become teachers that the data tells us serves no purpose to enhance the profession. And what we're actually doing by keeping them is we are limiting the quality of the profession because we're unfairly keeping people out of it. So my suggestion is we look at this in the way we have looked at other issues so far in the commission.
Fair enough.
I just want to agree with everything Van said. I would also like to say that given that we're going to put this data on a dashboard, I think it's really important that we use useful data and not data that's just not connecting the dots and triangulating other things. I think that's the point here. Could you go back to slide 1, please, Kim?
So you mean this one?
Could you remind me, please, what year they took master's pay away?
That
13
would
or
have been
14?
13.
So in 2013, they took master's pay away, and 4 years later, the graduating class dropped by over 500 students. I just want to point that out. So thinking it has no impact on the teaching profession, I think is something we need to seriously think about.
But there's a national trend. Isn't there a national trend on graduates and teacher ed programs declining?
There's a national trend, but if you look at the data point of it going out, the negative publicity
And I don't disagree.
that North Carolina had in 2013, and the people that enrolled, it dropped. It dropped from the year before, It dropped over time, but I just want to point that out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, I just wanted to give you a sample screenshot of the dashboard that's we're rolling out very soon, and kind of how you will have filters at the top, so it'll allow the end user to cut the data in multiple ways. This is a chart on the valuation ratings of teachers by standard and the percentage of teachers that are being evaluated at a certain standard, but there will be all those data points that you saw on the previous slide will be available for inspection. And the last thing we presented to the board was just an update on the changes to the support model for national accreditation for our North Carolina Ed Prep programs. And what the current situation is that in the past we have provided very hands-on customized supports to our EPPs in their pursuit of national accreditation. And we're finding with the capacity of our Ed Prep department and the increased demands from legislation and policy on our team that we just cannot support the high level of face-to-face support that we've been providing to EPPs for the accreditation process. And so we have notified EPPs, the board, and this commission of reallocation of resources within that division, and we want to make it clear that we will still support all the aspects of accreditation that we have in the past, but that support may be virtual and more generic than it has in the past. We know kind of the things that EPPs need in order to complete the process, and we're hoping we can make some generic packaging of resources, and of course the data for EPPs will be customized, and we'll still continue to supply data to the EPPs that are necessary for this, but where we are moving to a model where it's more virtual support than direct face-to-face contact. And I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have on that.
No, I think as long as there is support, I don't think virtual versus face-to-face matters. And if there needs to be a face-to-face because someone needs it, I'm sure you will. I mean, it would have to be to the point that would need to happen. Y'all would do it. I mean, you would send someone, right?
We will do everything we possibly can do to support.
I mean, I don't even know if I can think of a situation where it would need to happen, but if somebody, I guess, was in real trouble, then it would be like technical assistance. That might need to happen. But in terms of being in touch, I think as long as it's virtual and long as they can have an answer, I think it's fine.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Tomlin. All right, Dr. Andrew Seiberg will discuss the Educator Preparation Program Performance-Based Weighted Accountability Model Proposal
Can you say that again?
to fulfill requirements of HB 107. I cannot.
Good morning, everybody. So this is the sort of the culmination of a little more than a year's worth of work. We started this around, was it November of last year, something like that, October? I'm looking at Kim. Kim's saying October. So first I want to thank all the folks on the two subcommittees that have been working on this to date, specifically the leadership of Dr. Dempsey and Mr. Lakis, who have chaired those two subcommittees in this area. And I'm just going to walk you through this, and there are a couple of decision points that need to be made here ultimately to make a recommendation to the board. Again, what we're trying to do is satisfy a requirement in 107 that is asking that a weighted composite model be developed for the JLEOC to review in February 15 of 2020. So to that end, I'm just going to sort of tee up what has been developed, and then also draw some attention to some concerns that have been brought forth in the discussions over the past year, as well as some of the stakeholders from out in the field, and then sort of take a step back and see if the chairs of the subcommittees would like to add any other thoughts, and then think about what the motions and recommendations might be from that point. So essentially, what these two subcommittees have looked at is essentially 4 domain areas to look at for an accountability model. Domain 1 is around the performance of candidates coming out of those prep programs using essentially 4 different measures: the evaluation of teachers, EVOS data as it pertains to growth, proficiency, which we do not have a practicable application for proficiency yet, but that is something that we're looking to work on going forward, and it's certainly something that was mentioned in 107 as something that they would like in the model. And then EdTPA and PPAT. So those are the components that fall within Domain 1. Domain 2 only has one measure, which is 1-year retention rate. Again, that came from an initial desire from drafts of 107 that were inclined to look at 2-year retention data. Ultimately, that was dropped. There is still interest from the legislature to understand 2-year retention rates, and that's something we'll have to report on. And it was the interest of the subcommittees to look at 1-year retention rate, long story short, to be in Domain 2. Domain 3 on the next slide has to do with stakeholder perceptions. As most programs are aware, we have been collecting recent graduate survey data for a number of years. We also have been collecting employer survey data for a number of years. This has been a requirement from the legislature for some time now. And so having both of those measures in place was the desire of the two subcommittees to include in Domain 3. And then Domain 4 has to do with candidate demographics. For a preponderance of the stakeholders in these discussions, the idea of calling on educator preparation programs to look carefully at ways to diversify their candidate populations. That was something that spoke strongly from some folks. And to that end, there are 5 different areas that were considered in that Domain 4 area. I would also like to make clear that was not, while the desire to diversify the candidate pool is certainly something everybody would champion, there have been some very strong voices in these discussions over the past year about the challenge of requiring that as a point of accountability. And the concern there has to do with the limitations that educator preparation programs have on the folks that essentially they're pulling from, because for those of you who are not in the educator preparation program world, they are pulling from folks that are completing their sophomore year of college, and the educator preparation programs begin in their junior year. So it's not like they're recruiting from high school perspective there. So they're, if an institution is an all female institution, for example, then requiring, a certain percentage of males as a requirement seems to be very challenging for them. And so this is the dilemma that has been going on in Domain 4. And I'm sure there'll be some discussion on that in a little bit. But I just want you to know that of the 4 domains, Domain 4 is one that has had the most discussion, and for very good reason, from both sides. So let's go to the next slide. Basically, this slide it's not providing you any more information other than to put all of them all on one page so you can see them. So with that, let me go to the following slide. Essentially, yes, I'm sorry.
This is Hank, sorry.
Sure.
If you get back to the second domain, can you operationalize that definition for us a little bit? I've gotten a lot of questions from the field about what the one-year retention means and
Sure.
when it starts and when we measure it.
Sure. So let's start with the first point, which is that there are some concerns from the field. There are certain institutions that are producing teacher candidates that many of them may not actually stay in North Carolina. So if Andrew University has 100 candidates, of which 50 of them leave to go to other states or to return to their home state, and they're out of state when they come to North Carolina for their education, we would not hold the 50 that left to the denominator. So in essence, the starting point is to look at those folks who have taken on a position within North Carolina. So the denominator of the calculation would be only those folks that stayed in North Carolina and took on a position. And the conclusion of the first year would be the point at which the 1-year retention would be calculated. So how many of those folks who started in North Carolina and were employed in North Carolina in the beginning of the year are just continuing to teach all the way through to the end of the first year. So that's the way we have interpreted the 1-year retention. If we were to look at 2-year retention, which is something that is required for the lawmakers to look at in the future, it's sort of the same process, but we would look at the end of the second year in terms of calculating that outcome. Does that give you a little more clarity, Dr. Weddington?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so if you think about, and again, this is going to allay hopefully some of the concerns that we've heard, and you all have seen some of the concerns that have been trickling in over the past couple days. In terms of how to assess candidate demographics, the subcommittee, recognizing that this was a challenge, and wanted to make sure that this was accessible, essentially came up with the strategy to see if we could come up with 3 ways to meet the expectations of the various demographic considerations for Domain 4. So the first would be to meet or exceed a set standard. So, and it would be at ultimately we would have to decide, the commission would have to decide what that standard would be. I know in the past I have set the standard as if the teacher population looked and was similar to the student population, that would be one way that you could set a standard. But there are a variety of ways that you could cut that. So essentially, we would set a standard for each of these areas, and if an institution met or exceeded that, then they would be in compliance with that particular subdomain. The second area would be to look carefully. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
If you want to finish your thought, though.
Do you want me to go through the whole thing, or do?
No,
Go ahead.
I just thought. I'm sorry for this.
Sure.
I had a question about the retention, right? This idea of retention.
Sure.
And I don't even know if it's possible, but is it possible for the department to collect data on whether or not candidates were, or teachers were offered a second contract and chose not to return? Because to me, I feel like that's almost a better indication of their preparation. That in fact, they had an effective year, their principal offered them another year, but they decided to leave teaching or to move to another state.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, they completed the first year, they were not asked to return. That's a preparation, potentially a preparation problem.
That's an excellent question. I can talk clearly. Right now, we do not have the systems in place to capture that, and I'm not sure how we would capture
So
that.
I just like us to put that on the table for if we get to a point where the General Assembly is asking us for 2-year retention, then I would like for us to think about how we figure out how do we get rid of that idea of retention, and let's move to whether or not they were offered employment and figure out a way to capture that.
Okay.
I'm hoping that in a couple of years we have a better system to do that, but I don't know. But I think that, to me at least, feels like a better indication of if we're going to hold EPPs accountable for preparation, then I think that's a better measure. And I could be wrong. People could disagree with it, certainly.
Would that be, Michael, are you thinking that would be like a subset that we need to look at for triangulation, like over the 2 years?
No, I was just thinking, instead of this idea of did they go
Come back the
go
second-
from 1 year to the second year, which is
Yeah.
what we seem to be measuring, to were they in fact offered employment? Because we could be penalized as an EPP
If they
for
just
something
moved to
that was
South Carolina.
entirely out of our control. And I think that's one of the things we're struggling with this is this is one of those factors that's not entirely within our control. If somebody chooses to go to another state, or they're offered a job that's better paying, like imagine that, right?
Or they're a music teacher or an ag teacher and they no longer have that program.
Yes.
There could be lots of things.
So the offer of a contract is an employment issue, which generally NCDPI does not collect data on employment. That's the purview of the local districts. And so that measure could only be collected insofar as a LEA decided to give it to us.
Okay.
And then there's questions about
Yeah.
validity. I mean,
Understand.
whether I offered you a contract or not and you rejected me might not be a data point, a variable that we could get really good, clean data on.
Could it be incorporated into the employer survey?
But I still think you have the same problem of, in a situation where someone is separating from an LEA, you're either going to get the perspective of the LEA. I offered them a contract and they rejected me, which is not. You can see why an LEA may not want to be as forthcoming with that information as we would like them to be. Or if you're getting it from the student, who rejected who is the question here. We're trying to gather evidence on, and I think either way you're going to have there's some question as to whether you're going to get good, reliable data.
We've already baked in, we're gonna get the employer survey.
Right, but what you're saying is I'm going to ask the employer whether I offered that teacher a contract or not.
Well, I don't know if I understand that dilemma, but if all we're asking the employer to say is it your preference that this person return?
Oh,
in the
Or would you
survey?
rehire this person?
Would you rehire?
right. If we conducted that, I think prior to the contract
Do you answer
deadlines
that?
for these folks, and I think you could get some reasonably
Is that protected?
good data.
We're not asking for
could you
individuals,
repeat
right? Because
that,
we're asking
please?
in the aggregate.
So the question is, could we so there's a couple of things here that I want to address with that particular question. The question, Ms. Jones, is can we attach an item to the employer survey that says, would you like to retain this person, or would you be interested in reemploying this person for the following year? I have to say
I
we've.
think I would worry about that from a legal perspective.
I think that's exactly where I was getting ready to go. You've got
Yeah.
you've got a statement from the
Goes there.
employing principal that they'd like to reemploy. Something may happen in the interim, and then the LEA feels there is some kind of risk of exposure there for. It's. I'm not saying that we can't explore ways to try to make this happen. I'm just the current system. I don't know how we would do it and get really good data on it.
I have a question, and you may have said this, Tom or Andrew. If the candidate or teacher moves from Greene County to Lenore County, would that be picked up? Would this retention, would they have to stay with Patrick? Would they have to stay in Greene County for this retention to matter, or will it pick it up if they move to a different county?
Stay in
Because-
North Carolina, is that right?
Is it a
As long as they
state?
stay in North Carolina, because they would still be in the employment database for us.
And it should be traditional, and if they move to a charter, then it should still get picked up as well, right?
That's correct, yeah, because
Okay.
that calculation is
That's
based
what I
off the
thought, I
employment
just wanted to
database.
be clear, cause that's another way to, it won't get to, I moved to South Carolina, but it will get to, I moved across the county line. Yeah, yeah.
And that's what I was gonna say, could some of that be gathered from that where, and I don't know how we'll bust that salary and licensure stuff, but is there a point where once you left that LEA, you've answered, you may not know why they left or why they left North Carolina, but would that help answer some of those questions?
So I think it's very clear to me, and let me put this out there for folks to think about. The State of the Teaching Profession report, the work we do with the State of the Teaching Profession report should give us high leverage in answering some of these questions. So in that report, we don't count somebody as attrition unless they leave public schools in North Carolina. So if I can't find them anywhere in a charter school or an LEA, that's the only time I would count them as a triter.
Triting.
A triting. Odd word. So there's that, and then we can track them with that. We do in that process we do get exit survey. We get fairly good data from our LEAs on exiting, reasons why an individual left. And so we can certainly pick those up and incorporate them into this model if that seems reasonable. I would say for early leavers, our data is better than later leavers. But we would just have to we just have to see how all these systems would come together to provide the data that we need. I don't want to reduplicate efforts that are going on as much as we can leverage one activity that's giving us good data for another purpose. I think that's the best way to go.
Okay, so we'll stay here. Thank you. So we're back on looking at the three ways to meet the expectations in these subdomains of the larger domain 4. We just talked about meeting or exceeding a set standard. The second way that you could meet this would be to look at your individual institution average. So if Elon has a...
Don't use me as an example for this one.
Okay. If Andrew University has a certain percentage if I'm an all-female school, right, or an all-male school or something like that, then obviously those looking at the individual institutions' demographics can certainly have an interesting lens on whether you're moving towards or meeting similar ratios and similar demographics within your EPP. So that's the second way to think about this. And then the third way would be to look at year-over-year growth. And again, this is something that we've looked at. The original model we looked at for this was through Tennessee. And that's to say that even if you are not where you need to be, if you're moving in a positive direction towards, say, the set standard or the institution average from the previous year, that would be meeting that as well. And then the assignment of the scale for this particular domain would be to consider if you've met all of the candidate demographic areas, or 4 out of 5, that you would get the maximum amount of points that you could achieve. And the point at which you would get potentially a sanction would be is if you only achieved 1 out of the 5 of the candidate demographics that were listed in Domain 4.
Andrew, can
Yes.
you explain one more time how geography is going? Yeah, geography.
I was hoping you weren't going to ask that.
How are we going to delineate that? I think it's an important variable, but it.
Let me pull on Mr. Lakis because I know that he was in there as well. Can you specify that, Mr. Lakis, or do you want me to try and take a swing at that one?
Geography?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're going back and forth on that. It was a late inclusion after we'd worked through the other 4, but to my understanding, it could be read as % rural. It's really aimed at making sure we track and hold ourselves accountable for making sure the program demographics include students from rural communities in North Carolina.
Right. And what that part I think is clear. It's how we're going to designate what's rural. So are we going to use the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 system, or are we going to use some other federal definition of what constitutes is it going to be at the county level? They come from a county that's defined as rural?
Yeah, I don't know that we've totally solved that yet. There certainly is a federal designation of urbanicity that we could look at. There are maybe 1 or 2 ways that we could look at to calculate that.
Yeah.
But either approach would essentially be heading in that direction.
Yeah, and I agree it's an important component. I just think we need to get to terms about how it's going to be defined.
Okay, is this a late ad, this geography,
This one came up in the last meeting that we had.
with the Pell eligible in the first gen?
Mm-hmm.
And you're saying it's gonna be recruiting from rural counties in North Carolina? That's the idea?
Again, the intent of Domain 4 is to try and diversify the population and broaden the pool of candidates that are coming in from a variety of different places. That's the intent of the Domain 4.
So they do not have to be from North Carolina? Because you're disadvantaging private schools whose mission is not necessarily to just educate folks from North Carolina, if that's what this is gonna go to. I need to be real clear on that.
And I don't think we would just look at North Carolina, but at least the spirit of that, when it was suggested,
Okay,
our subcommittee meeting, was that it would just be
my buddy.
students from rural backgrounds.
Right.
So the definition needs to be very clear, and I also am concerned about missions of institutions and all of a sudden saying we have to have, I'm not saying it's not important, but the missions of different institutions are for different things. And to state we need, candidates from rural areas, I'm not sure what I think that has to do with anything. We need candidates to teach in rural areas. Recruiting candidates that are recruited from rural areas don't necessarily go back to rural areas. We have data on that. I mean, we need people to go teach in Greene County, right? Maybe they're from Greene County. We had a candidate from Greene County. She teaches in she went to, so I realize we're trying to diversify this. I'm not in agreement with this whole domain and it being sanctionable because I do not have control over many of these things. I also have questions about how are we going to determine who's Pell eligible and how are we going to determine first generation? Is that going to be self-reported from the EPP?
Yeah, we would have to collect that from the EPPs during the reporting phase.
Okay, so Pell eligible, it's very difficult for EPPs to get that information because of the laws that exist. So that needs to be vetted before that's put in here. And first generation, we'd have to ask. That would be a self-report type thing. But we've tried to figure out who's Pell eligible, and that's We get pushback on that because of legal FERPA. So I'm not sure that's been vetted at the level. I'm not saying these things are Pell eligible or first generation. I don't disagree with those criteria, but I don't know how easy that's gonna be. First generation, yes, self-report. I also think that the male, of course, we've talked about the male percentage disadvantaging missions of single gender, but I see that the point scale has been corrected for that.
Well, it's still not correct because it still disadvantages them. Even if you have a 4 out of 5, still gets you the full 4 points. If I'm an institution that only serves women, then I still have one less region of this demographics to make my 4 out of 5, right? So I'm already disadvantaged. So it should really be 3 out of 4, or it needs to be slid so that it doesn't disadvantage those who serve only one male or female population.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. That it's not just that it's not that they would use the scale. That we would adjust the scale based on Title IX. I mean, we can't even include that for institution that only includes females. We would need to change the scale for that.
Can I ask a question? What is I see the scale, but at what point would an institution receive a consequence or a sanction or whatever? What number of points?
Right. So let me go to the next slide, and I'll walk you through the weighted model. Obviously, this is a quick slide, basically saying, for us to do domain 4, we're going to need a couple years worth of data to collect, over time to actually be able to talk coherently about that. It's that we don't have the current data to be able to implement that right now. So if you go to the next slide, the basic model would look something like this. We would have the 4 domains are sort of listed over on the left. We would apply, we would average those, the outcomes by all of these criteria into a scale of 1 to 4 on each of the 4 domains. Then we would apply a weight. And in this case, I have some numbers in there that has caused some confusion in the past. So let me clarify for everybody here. All I did was put in some arbitrary numbers. This was one of the multiple ways of looking at weighting. But the point is, whatever weight that the commission would like to move forward on would be applied there across the 4 domains, and that would ultimately lend itself to the weighted composite average. So when you're thinking about domain 4, there are 5 subdomains right now, with the idea of moving into an average for that demographic domain, and then assigning a particular weight of it along with the other domains to come up with the weighted composite average. Does that help?
That didn't really answer the question to me, Andrew.
Oh, what was? Take another swing at it.
So
Sorry.
it's one. You can get 1 point, 2 points,
You
3
get
points,
0
or 4
points.
points, or 0. At what level are sanctions triggered?
Okay, so now I understand your question. Go back 2 slides. So essentially the domain 4 is a series of yeses or nos, right? So if you met or exceeded in the 3 ways that you have an opportunity to meet the obligation of percent people of color, you would get a point associated with that. So at the end of those 4 different subdomains, you would have a maximum of 5 points, and you would be assigned that, at which point you would be getting the maximum 4 points if you had 4 of the 5 criteria or 5 of the 5 criteria. The point at which you would get a sanction is if you only met 1 of the 5 criteria in this domain, would be a potential sanctionable event.
Potential or sanctionable? Because
By definition, but the way we have defined the 4-point scale is if you are at a 1,
Yeah.
that is a sanctionable event.
okay,
Not a 2, not a 3, not a 4.
so again, you could be stellar in every category and be sanctioned in this category. I'm asking for clarification on that.
Yeah, can I
You could,
jump in real quick?
sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the big tenets of this proposal, proposed framework, is the shift away from sanctioning individual domains. It is based on a composite model. So you'd get your 1 through 4 rubric-based score for each of the 4 domains. They would be run through the weighted model, and each EPP would be given a score of 1, 2, 3, or 4, and the sanctions would be tied to that composite average. So you would not be dinged or held in sanctions for any one domain.
Thank you, Andrew.
And that was addressed in the subcommittees with, and given your concern that domain 4 should be included in the model, but according to the weighting, it's one of the 2 lowest weighted.
20%.
So you could have a 1 in domain 4, and by virtue of the weighting, it's gonna have less impact on
Right.
your aggregate score.
I'm worried we're gonna have people that have zeros, and I'm gonna be one of them.
Okay, so let's get to the conversational point of this, which is the next slide. Some decisions to be made. Let me share what we're trying to do is come to what we think is the best thing that we can send over to the JLEOC, and first and foremost to send to the Board of Education to consider a weighted accountability model for EPPs going forward. And to that end, the work of these 2 subcommittees and a lot of input, as well as input from the field, has shaped this into 3 domains everybody's in agreement with, and a 4th domain that everybody is idealistically, altruistically interested in, but has concerns about whether an EPP should be held accountable to those because of some of the limitations that have been discussed so far today.
Andrew, can I?
Sure.
Just one point you just made, because you said it was altruistically and idealistically, which I totally agree. But we also discussed that, and again, we addressed this at the summit Tuesday, that we do have research that shows that the diversity of the candidates as a community enhances the experience of all the candidates, and diversifying the teaching population within a school enhances the learning of all the students, and having more teachers of color in the presence of students of color enhances the education of students. So while I'm not criticizing idealistic and altruistic, but we also have data that says this domain is important to the quality of the profession.
And I would like to say, I agree, and I supported that, what we did on Tuesday, with dollars from our school. However, this is a bigger system problem than the EPPs. The EPPs cannot solve the problem that the state of North Carolina has created through its legislature policy.
Right. I'm just saying its presence in
Yes.
the proposal is in part driven by what we know from research and data, along with it is also morally a high calling.
So let me kind of set the stage here, and then I'll yield to the chairman to think about how to proceed. Did you have a comment,
Another comment.
Dr. Moore? Yeah.
I agree with both of you, right? I think this is really important. I think this also harkens back to the earlier conversation that we know that the standardized assessments, in particular, the Praxis Core, disproportionately impacts students of color. We also know that we don't have data on Praxis Core, but general standardized assessment data, right? Students who are first gen are also disproportionately impacted. And so what we've got here is we're asking universities to increase the numbers of students of color, first gen, Pell eligible. Those students are disproportionately impacted by standardized assessments, making it harder to have them enrolled in the program. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have this or anything. I just want to remind us that the standardized assessment has an impact on this piece as well. And so as we are collecting data and doing this for the next couple of years, I hope folks in the General Assembly are listening to this, right? This is an important issue. We want to diversify the teaching force. We have to talk about barriers to doing that.
So I want to say one more thing. So Well, I have several questions, but I want to say one more thing based on that. I appreciate that comment because I think that, and I appreciate Van's comment as well, because I feel like I know that, you know, people are considering this a big stick movement, right? This anytime you do an accountability model, people feel like that it's negative and it's a big stick movement, right? We're putting a big stick on EPPs. Like, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, and you got to do this. But what are the strategies that we're going to do that impacts the bigger system? So this little piece that we're doing isn't going to work to increase teacher population. It's the other things, for example, that do it. I just feel like we need to think about this in a bigger picture. And that's all for now.
I totally agree, Ann. This is Hank. I've been thinking about this a lot lately and thinking about the stick model. And one of the things we talked about in the subcommittee is that wouldn't it make a great thing for us to say, you know, we're going to shoulder this mantle and we're going to show that we're really serious about it and that maybe that will encourage others to jump on board. I think that's a little dangerous just based on my last 30 years in North Carolina education. A lot of times when we take things on, or try to do more with less, or try to go through and make something happen without adequate funding or resources, you know, we end up being the scapegoats for why it doesn't work out because we took that. So I think whatever we take to the legislature, I think we ought to make some kind of a statement that we want to do this. We want to be more diverse. We want to diversify the teaching workforce. We want more students in our programs from all areas and a more diverse student group. But we need everybody else to have the same stick as well.
Right.
The legislature needs
That's
to
right.
stick. I mean, somebody needs to put resources behind this, incentivize the profession again, expand the Teaching Fellows program so that we can get more candidates in, do a better job on the back end. I mean, I don't think that we can, I don't want to go into this and say we're going to do this and we're going to function programs based upon this, no matter how low it's weighted in the model, unless others are going to play a part in this and take some responsibility, or at least the same amount of responsibility that we're saying we're going to take for it.
Can I, Dr. Wellington, as always, I appreciate that, and I appreciated your incredibly thoughtful comment. And Ann and Van, you know, this is why, you know, we've come back to this time and again, and I think they're trying to build a responsive model that does not set up anybody to be, you know, for a big stick to be used, but to still say this is important. We're going to hold, you know, EPPs accountable to it and move it forward. The respectful push I'd offer the group, and I'd love to hear from Dr. Miller, Dr. Fleming, Dr. Houston, you know, Ms. Jones, is that the respectful push I would make is that our K-12 system already is held accountable. They have subgroup data. You know, they have to know how students are doing based on their background, and they're absolutely accountable for those outcomes. So the push I'd make is that there are a large group of leaders and practitioners in our education system who are accountable for this already. We would be joining them.
I have some questions. Can I move to them?
This is Sam. I would comment somewhat in favor of what was just said. I don't have any doubt that the challenge is different and difficult at the university level to deal with subpopulations or populations of any type, because you don't know who's coming, you don't know what the pool is going to look like. I recognize that. But I think we're remiss if we don't, even though we suspect that there could be failure, if we don't address the fact that our school populations are changing drastically, if we don't get some teachers that look like the kids, that we're having to move through the system,
Yes, that's right.
we're not doing all that we can do now. Yeah, it will change some behaviors, and I would guess there are going to be some people that aren't going to meet the standard. But that also opens the door to address the issues that were mentioned earlier, which is we need some help. General Assembly, we're trying to do this. This is important to North Carolina. Here's the challenge. We've got to have some help. And I know we'll get criticism, but I think we've got to address diversity in a hurry. If we don't, we're really just sticking our head in the sand.
This is Glenda, and I think just a couple of points there would be, I'm not sure who was speaking before Sam was speaking, but I would say that, LEAs have been and continue to be gatekeepers when it comes to identifying, supporting, and growing effective teachers that have the ability to impact diversity within our student subgroups. And that's an expectation, and that's something that our legislators, our state board, everyone holds us accountable for. Where I struggle a bit with this accountability model, and I understand EPPs have to have an accountability model just like public schools and LEAs have to have with regards to the effectiveness of teachers with our students on a day-to-day basis. But there's a much bigger problem or root cause, and without support at the legislative level that goes back to funding and teaching fellows and other groups that may recruit our minority populations in to put them in front of our students. EPPs, I'm just not sure that this accountability model, and I realize we've got to start somewhere, but how does that help an EPP go out and get students of color to come in and teach? I mean, there's a bigger picture here, and I think that may be outside the scope of this commission without the support and statutory changes at the state level, because we really need help on the recruiting end of that. EPPs need help with the recruiting end of that. People are not knocking down their doors, and you folks can speak up and tell me, what we're seeing come out is there's not a huge graduating class at any of our schools, in state or out of state. So something has to change at the state level that says, this is a respected profession. We're going to pay you what you're worth, get you to do this, but these are the changes we're going to make legislatively so that you're going to want to go into the profession, so that we can have an accountability model that works for our EPPs. But to try to hold them accountable for increasing the diversity in their programs, or the first, from socioeconomic to, gender to race, I just don't know how we can do that, but that's just my 2 cents.
I do. Thank you, Glenda. Thank you for those comments. It's really helpful when we're in partnership with our K-12s. And all the EPPs realize that K-12s have had to deal with subgroups for a long time, and that is definitely something that's challenging. I do have a question. So Tennessee has this as part of their model, correct? Not exactly like this, but this type of characteristic?
That's correct.
That's correct. Has it made a difference in Tennessee? Do we know? Because I would like to know that answer. I think that could be very helpful for us. I know you may not know, and Tom has left the room.
I believe that model is relatively new, and I don't know that we have like 6 or 7 data points to see what is going on there. I did get I've reached out to Tennessee to get some hard data from them about 2 weeks ago, and the fellow just actually got back to me yesterday. So I can certainly follow up with him and see to what extent that has had an impact, or what kind of impact that area has had.
Well, I think that not having that data we might want to consider some other things. Patrick, did you want to say something?
That gives me a thank you, Dr. Bullock, for that segue. And
You're
I'm
welcome.
going to make a suggestion for everyone to consider, and then ask that we take a 5-minute break, because I drank a lot of coffee on the way up here. But why, if I think everyone is in agreement that we need to consider somehow the criteria that are in the fourth domain. However, it is not required in statute. So would the commission be interested in looking at the fourth domain, collecting that data, making it a pilot domain for several years while we collect the data, look at it to be sure there are no unintended severe negative consequences for EPPs, and put a consequential start date on it at some point in the future after we've had a chance to see the data and to make any technical corrections that might need to be made. I would ask that, go ahead, Dr. Bull.
I have a clarifying question, Patrick. Would that mean I would support piloting it to see, because I think we're saying positive and negative things about it. I'm saying lots of negative things about it. So I would like to know if I'm right or not. I don't think Tennessee's provided us a roadway to see if it will move the needle or not. I would like for it to come back to Pepsi.
Oh, it would absolutely have to come back to Pepsi.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, could you not have a date on it at this time and we just,
It would be up to the commission, yes, absolutely.
I would say just,
I would just say do it and then.
Dr. Miller, if we were to do that as a commission, could we also make, suggestions like what Hank put in his notes about, we believe that if we're going to look at this as a pilot, these are the things that we also feel like must accompany those, like the teaching fellows expansion, like the $12,000. I mean, like those kind of suggestions that would go along with this as well, because I think as we look at this in the future, if those things don't shift, I don't think we're ultimately going to see the data that we all want in improving this facet of why we're having this domain.
Anyway.
So could that be
This is Connie, I agree with that statement.
I don't think there's any harm in we can't force anyone to change policy, but we can certainly do our very best to influence it.
Policy recommendation?
Yep. So Andrew, do you 5 more minutes or do you?
no, I was just gonna say.
Yeah, if we
we'll
could
take-
break for 5 minutes, I would personally appreciate it a great deal.
I've learned so much about Dr. Miller.
We will reconvene at 10:30.
For the minute, they're 50.
read the whole website report already? Okay. I'm like 60 pages deep.
Is it worth it? Summary.
No, I have a different purpose, right?
Okay, we'll bring the meeting back to order, and we'll pick back up where we were. Dr. Seiberg talking about the piloting the fourth domain for several years, still collecting and looking at the data, but making it unconsequential or unsanctionable for a period of time until we have I think Dr. Bullock's point about getting the data from Tennessee and having it presented to Pep-C as soon as we can would be beneficial. And then looking to see over X number of years what, if any, are the unintended consequences. I don't think anyone is in disagreement that this is the right thing to do. We just need to be very deliberate and careful.
So
I
to,
concur.
so to that end, let me just share a couple thoughts. If we were to embark on the collection of domain 4, we would start that in the collection process. That would begin in April is when we start the reporting process, and it would take 2 years worth of data for us to be able to think about how we're setting up these other domain areas, because we would want to look at not just the current year's worth of data, but growth over time. So we would need 2 data points. So if we were going to go down that path and sort of look at domain 4 as a non-consequential domain for the moment, we would probably need no less than 2 years, maybe even 3 years, to actually fully understand what's going on and how it might affect positively or negatively the grand equation.
Can we go back and capture prior data?
Depends on whether the EPPs are capable of collecting that. Like when we ask for things like percent Pell eligible, and those are things that, I think we have to think very carefully across all the institutions as to what, how accessible some of those variables are and to what extent we can collect them. So the answer is I don't know yet until we actually scratch around.
That can give you EPPs a homework assignment to go back and find out if we can collect that.
Is any of that collected on Title II? No, I didn't think so.
You mean with ETS and all that for
Yeah.
the feds? I don't know.
No reported. Whether or not somebody can collect it in your institutional research is a different story.
Yeah.
It's, it would be in, at least in UNC system institutions, it would be in the institutional data, depending on how it depends on how geography is defined. So if it's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 county, we would have that in the data. It'd have to be,
Somebody's got to set a flag for it.
Somebody's got to run it, yeah.
And do that work. So the institutional research on campus are going to have to do some stuff to help us be able to collect that data. It's not sitting there necessarily. I think that Pell and First Gen's probably not sitting there. Pell and First Gen are probably in the data already, but the regional stuff is absolutely certainly not.
Well, then you might as well, for the privates, look up New York, Maryland, New Jersey. I'll say for East Carolina, for border schools, yeah.
Can somebody help us with what the federal definition options would be for geography?
Well, I know. Yeah, we can certainly scratch around. I know there is an urbanicity component that's accessible for all K-12 schools. So we could link potentially students to the level of urbanicity that they are coming out of, and that's at the federal level. So we could look at a candidate coming from anywhere in the country. There may be other ways as well. I just am not as familiar with that. We can certainly scratch around on that. But I know there is at least one that is in play.
So that then brings us to if we want to move in this direction, the weighting is going to be different. Obviously, we would be weighting 3 domains rather than 4, if that is the will of the commission, and it looks like all of the pre-work in waiting has been done with 4 domains.
So, yeah, so again, go ahead.
I'd like to make a comment if I might. I actually kind of like the idea of collecting some data, calling it a pilot, whatever you want to call it, but I think we should announce that this is a pilot, that we recognize there's a problem. We're going to search for some answers. We'll produce a paper with a plan at some date certain, so that we don't just look like we've talked about the issue and we're walking away from it. I believe we need to make it clear that the commission believes, whatever, and that we're going to try to do something about it. Putting people on notice that once this is done, we'll have some idea about how we can recruit, how we can get minority teachers in the classroom and in schools of education. It might even take some interviewing to ask kids at the various institutions, what would it take to get you in a teacher training program? But I believe we ought to make a statement that we're doing this with the intent of coming forward with a plan to address a real problem.
So, Dr. Houston, this is Andrew. I do know, under the way this thing is moving forward is ultimately this will go before the JLEOC, and we will have to. Obviously, it has to pass this commission in some sort of consensus recommendation to the board. The board has to approve it, and then it goes to the JLEOC for consideration. So I think that is exactly the way we would word it. We would say, look, that there's unanimous, understanding and agreement that diversifying the workforce is certainly important. We do not have the data points to set that up, but we feel really strongly as a commission to move in that direction. To that end, we're going to set up potentially these 3 is our best foot forward with domain 4, out in a couple of years out, once we have a careful study of and collection and how we can look at it going forward. So that, and then ultimately it's at the will of the JLEOC to think about whether they want to change any legislation from that point.
Well, and this is Freebird. I also think that with the West Ed release with the Leandro, that this gives us an opportunity to look at specific points that were made in that document and line them up with some of the pieces that we know are going to need to accompany, again, how that pilot works and what initiatives and programs we're developing, or we're not developing, but we're asking to be developed to support this.
Good point, Freebird.
Okay. Do you want to talk about good points as well, Freebird? Thank you for that.
So I think question 1 is it the will of this commission to proceed? I'm hearing some momentum here that sort of broke the stalemate about looking at three domains, with the 4th one not being consequential at this point, but to collect data and move forward on that in a couple of years. Before we go any further than that, can maybe we should proceed
Yes.
with that as a
Would
question.
someone be willing to make a motion to proceed under that provision?
I will make the motion. The stalemate will make the motion. I make a motion that we proceed forward with an accountability model that first 3 domains are consequential and the 4th one is pilot, not consequential at this point, with the understanding that the point value will have to be reworked to be equitable.
We have to do the point value, so
Period.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's part 2.
But to
of this.
take that forward, and also with the idea that strategies will have to be attached. I want that in the motion.
With strategies attached.
With strategies for success attached.
I second the motion.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we have a
So
motion and a
eloquent.
second. to move forward with 3 consequential domains, 1 pilot domain, and to make sure that success strategies are attached,
Or discussed.
or presented,
Yeah.
moving forward at the appropriate time.
So we, in discussion.
Yes, and any further discussion?
Does the point value need to be determined now, or is that gonna be a second?
I would prefer to be able to say coherently to the board in January that it is the will of the commission that domain 1 have X% weight, that domain 2 have X% weight. Before we go any further than that, notice in the last slide there, we had 4 domain weighting because that was where we were heading. And you can see without I mean, obviously, let me cut you all loose to have the discussion. But the overall consensus in all these separate little pieces that we've been collecting is that there is strong interest in weighting domain 1 and domain 3 the heaviest. And domain 2, while important, the broader consensus is that it is a very small slice of the overall composite model. So having said that, I would love for a discussion around that.
Let us first vote to make sure that we're on the 3. We've got a motion and a second.
Sorry.
Hey, don't be disregarding my motion.
I'm
That's
sorry
on the
about
floor.
You're in
So,
motion.
any further discussion before the vote?
Can I actually say something, Chairman Miller?
Sure, absolutely.
I appreciate the spirit of collaboration and compromise of the group, and I think progress has been made. But I'd be remiss if I just didn't take a moment to share my thoughts on this and to both celebrate the progress, but to just make a charge. Not only has Tennessee put this in place, but New Mexico has as well, and our neighbors in South Carolina proposed a bill earlier this year to make this part of their accountability model for EPPs as well. And so I do think this is an important step forward for us to join them and to maybe emerge as leaders in this process. But I'd also just name that, the research is coming out, the data is nascent, but I think emerging. To what Dr. Dempsey mentioned earlier, that diversity isn't just altruistic or nice to have. It massively determines student outcomes and has an amplified effect on student outcomes who've been poorly served by our education system throughout its history. And so as we make this, the charge to this group is that we really treat this as a 2-year pilot, that we dig into it, that we figure out how to hold ourselves accountable to this, and that we really treat it with the seriousness we treated this conversation, and that we help the public and the legislature and everyone else understand just how critical this is to the future of education in North Carolina.
Agreed and well said, Mr. Lakis.
I just want to say that I would like us to look towards South Carolina and all the strategies they've put in place to support recruitment and support retention of teachers. They have done a phenomenal job turning that state around and with their leadership. So I think it would be hand in hand, Andrew, that they're an example of, we have these strategies in place. Now we're saying you're going to be held accountable. So that's a two pieces in the pod there, or whatever. Go ahead.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of Dr. Bullock's motion, please let it be known by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Are there any opposed? All right, Dr. Bullock, your motion has been approved. So
I'm so
we will
glad.
move forward with 3 consequential domains and a 2-year pilot for the other.
So the second point then would be to what degree would we weight the first 3 domains? And let's go ahead and pull up the 4 domains. Go back like maybe 3 slides to where you can see all 4 on this. Down one more.
Based on the weights that I saw on the previous slide where you had the 4 weights, I would throw out, just to get the discussion started and a little down the road maybe, that we consider 45, 10, 45. I'm not married to that. I just throw that out as a discussion starter, and pushback and feedback is welcomed.
This is Hank. I'll throw in one more. It's that, I think we've all said throughout this discussion that domain one may be the thing that we have the most, direct control over. So I would push for something that looked more like 60, 10, 30, as opposed to the 1 and 3 having the same weight, since we don't have quite as much control over those surveys and whether or not those surveys are good objective ratings of what we're doing or not. Important, of course, but we have much more control over what's happening in domain 1.
I agree.
Thank you.
And to follow Hank's, I was gonna suggest 50, 20, 30, so looks like we're somewhere in the, clearly 1 is going to have half, somewhere around half.
Can you live with 60, 10, 30?
I can live with 50, 40, 10. 50, 10, 40, yeah, because we don't know what retention's gonna do. And that might be we don't know if that's gonna be biased or not.
Yeah, Hank, can you work through that a little bit more? So, I mean, Patrick asked me if I could live with a loading 60 on one domain makes me nervous. Recognizing
I hear what you're saying, and I'm not opposed to a 50, 20, 30. Again, I worry about what retention does based on how we're defining it right now and how that'll impact us if we ever go to a 2-year, because it still feels a little bit wishy-washy. So if they start the first year and they finish the first year without quitting halfway through the year, then we're going to say that they were retained, and that's going to be our number. It really doesn't tell anything about how they were prepared, right? Because anything could have caused them to leave during the course of the year. And I'm guessing I don't know what that number is or what the percentage is that actually happens, but I'm not sure that tells us that it had anything to do with their performance in the classroom.
Yeah, Hank, I agree with you. I feel like a 50, 10, 40 feels like it's the right weighting based on the things that we can control, and again putting the least amount on that retention, because I think there are problems with retention.
Yeah, so would you say?
50, 10, 40.
Yeah, I agree with 50, 10, 40.
40 feels too high on stakeholder perceptions to me. And I wonder if we could, I think I was moved by the 60, 10, 30. I'm just wondering, EPP performance in these measures feels like we should significantly weight them higher.
Well, I think
40 feels too close to me.
Well, sure, but I think from the conversation that we had earlier about the disproportionate impact on particular students, we're putting an awful lot of weight on standardized assessment again, and then we've got a state that is eliminating standardized tests. So now we're going to have, the greatest proportion is going to be elementary ed,
55.
and so we're essentially looking at EVOS that is going to overweight elementary, right? Underweight other areas. So I worry a little bit about having that 60%. But I do agree that it is really important. I just worry about an overemphasis and this narrow definition of.
So what if we split the difference? What if we did 55, 10, 35? That would split the difference. And I don't know if that's right. I think we need to look at it, over time, but.
Yeah. I think my bigger concern, Dr. Marlowe, is helpful. Not that we put all our eggs in the EPP not that we put all of our eggs in domain 1. I just think stakeholder perceptions was too close to EPP performance, and I think that's where my concern would be. So maybe it's 50, 20, 30, maybe it's 55, 10, 35, but I think there should be a large gap between domain 1 and domain 3, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. 55. I like the 55, 10, 35.
I have one more question. So one of the things that we've talked about, I don't know that we've ever settled for sure, is EdTPA and PPAT are a licensure examination, which I guess by statute at this point, we should not keep somebody from being licensed because they were to fail that exam. So I guess my question is, when will those scores be reported? Is it in the year that they are recommended for licensure, or do they get the 3 or 4 years to pass that exam, and it's once they pass, we say, I'm trying to figure out when that happens, if we're supposed to release them without passing that potentially. And I'm wondering if we ought to weight those 4 within that domain to make it maybe less consequential for what Dr. Morrow was saying in terms of the EVOS data only really measuring elementary at this point.
Dr. Weddington, this is Andrew. So EdTPA and PPAT falls under the same rules as any other license area. So it's attempt in the first, pass in the third. So it would have the same sort of opportunity. And to that end, EdTPA and PPAT only became fully online this year. So we're just starting to collect that data. So obviously you would, there's the potential, just like in any of the other licensure areas, that Andrew might have attempted this year and may not get back to passing it for another year or 2 or even 3. They have 3 years to actually get it done. So, but that's how that test is falling. It's falling under the same obligations as other licensure exams.
So, based on the different models, Andrew, that you, Tom, and Kim have run, using these, is there any recommendation, or is there any feedback on this 50 versus 55 versus 60 that you could see could put a potential EPP skew toward potential negative results for an EPP that we need to take into consideration? Do you understand my question?
I don't know that I've run it at the 55, 10, 35. What I have seen is when you think about the level system that we're putting together, to think about exceptionally high achieving EPPs, those that are thriving, those that are meeting minimum requirements, and those that fall below, an overwhelming, no matter how we cut this, an overwhelming fall in the 2 and 3 category, with a couple in the 4 category, and in the different ways that I've run it to date, no one has fallen into the level 1 system. But again, I was only using the 3 domains because I only have data for those first 3 domains. We don't have data for the 4th domain.
Right.
So
Well, that helps. I think that helps we're kind of guesstimating in some way, which for people to be sanctioned or not, we're kind of using
and keep in mind that when the 4th domain goes live, we're going to have to adjust these. So we'll have an opportunity in 2 years to recalibrate, if you will.
if the 4th domain goes live.
I will not argue that point right at this particular
Because it's
time.
a pilot, so we don't know.
This is correct. So, is it 55, 10, 35? Is that where we are at this point? What is the will of the commission?
I mean, for what we know,
Let me make a motion.
Yes, sir.
So I move that we set the weighting at 55, 10, 35.
Have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Dr. Bullock. We have a motion and a second to weight the domains at 55, 10, 35. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of approval, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Motion has been approved. Yes, sir, Andrew.
So I have one other request. I heard some really compelling discussion, and I'm really appreciative to be in these conversations. It's very rewarding to think about the impact that these kind of things can have on ultimately teachers and children across the state. The question that I have to you, Chairman Miller, is I heard earlier a discussion about we like the idea, the collective commission, like the idea of thinking about Domain 4 But there are some other things that would be really helpful to have in place to help support item 4. I'm wondering out loud if we should gather some stakeholders to develop that white paper so that we can have that as another item, because I don't know, I think you guys are closer to that, and I wouldn't want to do that unilaterally, and I think the expertise in the room could lend itself to some very poignant arguments in February.
I'll call on Dr. Dempsey.
Mr. Lakis, are you seated?
That,
You're in a chair, or are you sitting down?
I'm here. My heart rate is good.
Good. Because as we were having that conversation, it seems to me that we can continue with momentum that happened in the cross-section of the two subcommittees. And I'd suggest we ask the subcommittees, and Andrew, I'd be willing to continue to co-chair with you to take that task on behalf of the commission to tease out what we mean in Domain 4, what are the resources and strategies the state would need to adopt, and reach out beyond the commission itself to bring in the stakeholders to put that white paper together. But you and I would take the lead along with members of the two subcommittees who are willing.
Yeah, 100%.
Good.
I love that idea.
So I need a
I
motion.
second that.
Do we need a formal motion and a second to do that? I'm looking at Eric. Are we good for the subcommittee to do that work?
I think you can direct the subcommittee. I don't think you need.
Okay, well, I so direct, and no motion and second is needed.
I'll just make that up.
Even if you did, it works for me. Are we good? Is that all the business? All right, so thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for today's discussions. I remind the commission members that our next monthly meeting will be held in this room on Thursday, January 16th from 9 to 12. We have now completed our meeting, and unless there's additional business at this time, I ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Have a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we all thrilled to know I will not be here in January. Well, we have the board of, our board, with our president, like the